My name's Tom, welcome back to my channel and to another episode of How to Read It, my series in which I aim to provide some accessible introductions to some quote-unquote classic bits of literature. This second entry in the series was going to see us take a look at Pride and Prejudice, but with the new television adaptation of Catch-22 currently streaming on Hulu and on terrestrial TV, at least here in the UK, I thought there was likely at least one or two people out there who might be thinking about giving the book a go. So today we're going to take a quick overview of the background behind Catch-22, its plot and its style, to set you off on the right foot in potentially reading it. Before we get going, if you have any questions or thoughts as we go along, then please do feel free to comment those down below in the comments, and if you're new around here and this seems like your kind of thing, then please do consider subscribing and importantly hitting that notifications bell. With that out of the way, however, let's take a look at Catch-22 and how to read it. Catch-22 is one of those rare novels which, though being less than 60 years old, has struck such a chord with readers that its very title has passed into common parlance. The phrase Catch-22 has come to be widely used in the Anglophone world to express the very specific kind of frustration that one often feels when faced with the pedancy of authority and the often circular logic of bureaucracy. It's an expression of the exasperation that comes with being at the whim of an overextended higher power which, though seemingly presenting you with choices, damns you if you do and damns you if you don't. The novel itself follows an ensemble cast of officers in the United States Air Force in the final year of the Second World War. Here, the titular catch refers to a contradictory rule which states that if any airman feels themselves to be insane and thus in need of being sent home, they need only ask the squadron doctor who is duty-bound to fulfill their request. The catch being that any airman who does make the case that they ought to be sent home has, in doing so, proven their very sanity by being rightly scared of combat. Having proven themselves sane, such an airman must therefore stay and continue to fly more perilous missions. This kind of frustrating, illogical logic and circular reasoning finds numerous outlets during Catch-22. General Sherman might once have suggested during the American Civil War that war is hell, but viewed through the eyes of Yossarian, Catch-22's protagonist, we might come instead to the conclusion that war is weird, war is nonsensical, and war is often downright confusing. The process of reading the book can, in its attempts to convince us of this fact, often be equally frustrating. But hopefully, by the end of this video, you'll be armed with just enough context and framing to embrace it as one of the 20th century's most compelling pieces of literary satire. Catch-22 takes a great deal of influence from its author Joseph Heller's own experiences as a bombardier in the US Air Force during the final year of the Second World War. Much like the novel's central character, Yossarian, from May to December 1944, Heller found himself stationed in the Mediterranean, flying tactical support missions over Italy, where the Allied forces were gradually pushing the Axis powers up the Italian peninsula. Many of the endearing and eccentric characters which populate Catch-22 were certainly based heavily on Heller's own comrades. Nevertheless, it wasn't until 8 years after the war that Heller began work writing the novel, and it wasn't until 1961 that it was finally published, and those intervening years had a significant effect on the overall tone of the book. See, the Second World War had something of a moral clarity to it. It was, and largely still is, viewed as America's good war, in which a wide range of countries came together to consign fascism to the history books, for a while at least. In the years following, however, America found itself engaged in a number of conflicts which lacked such an image in the popular consciousness. First, the Korean War and then American intervention in Vietnam were mired in controversy. As Edward A. Suchman et al. Wrote during the former conflict, the wholehearted support of public opinion which characterized the last war is conspicuous by its absence in the Korean War. Instead of consensus, we have partisanship. In place of conviction and faith, we have divided opinion and doubt. Even those who were drafted weren't entirely sure what they were fighting for, or whether the cause for which they might lay down their lives was an honourable one. This context, 2 unpopular wars fought by doubt-ridden conscripted men, is perhaps even more important to bear in mind whilst reading Catch-22 than that of the Second World War. Indeed, in a 1975 interview with Playboy, Heller himself stated that Catch-22 wasn't really about World War II, it was about American society during the Cold War, during the Korean War, and about the possibility of a Vietnam. We might therefore follow Christina Jarvis in approaching Catch-22 as a Vietnamization of World War II. In place of the moral conviction and organisational lucidity that we tend to see in representations of the Second World War, such as Band of Brothers say, we see a paranoia, confusion and uncertainty more akin to Forrest Gump's portrayal of Vietnam. Now, I'm always keen to ensure that these videos avoid any great spoilers, but even so, to try and summarise Catch-22 by its plot would probably be a bit of a misfire. Of course, things happen within the book, but for the most part it's not driven by the same kind of narrative progression that we find in most mainstream cultural texts. The plot of the novel is instead highly fragmented, jumping backwards and forwards throughout time, and often diverging into lengthy tangents. Its chapters are, for the most part, named after various characters that exist within this strange world, and although the novel does lead to a fairly satisfying conclusion, this is emblematic of Heller's preference for building out a world through disconnected anecdotes and character sketches over telling a story in the beginning, middle, end sense. At the heart of the novel is Yossarian. A captain and bombardier, Yossarian is keen to do everything in his power to make it to the end of the war alive. In truth, he and many of his comrades should probably already be on their way home, having long since completed the 25 missions airmen are required to fly on a single tour of duty. The ruthlessly ambitious Colonel Cathcart, however, is desperate to become a general, and is thus keen to impress his superiors. As such, he continually raises the number of missions he expects those under his command to fly. By the beginning of the novel, 25 has become 50, and by the end it is a staggering 80. The central action of Catch-22 then is Yossarian's attempts to either get sent home or, at the very least, avoid flying any further missions. He becomes an expert at feigning a liver condition, just serious enough to warrant his being prescribed to bed rest, but not severe enough to warrant any potentially dangerous treatment. Elsewhere, he destroys his own radio headset to ensure that his plane has to return back to base before reaching enemy territory. Alongside this sit a number of key subplots. Colonel Cathcart's attempts to secure promotion, the squadron mess officer Milo Minderbinder's launching of a black market syndicate, and Yossarian's comrades' various dalliances with women whilst on leave in mainland Italy, all begin as mere anecdotes, but grow to be significant elements of the book, holding their own commentary on post-war American society. It's worth noting, however, that although much of what makes Catch-22 notable is its focus on the absurdity rather than horror of war, terror, loss, and violence are not entirely absent. And as the book progresses, we are increasingly given insight into exactly why Yossarian is so fearful of partaking in bombing runs, and into the devastating consequences of his superior's brazen ambition. Seemingly pointless sacrifice lingers at the edges of this novel, and the humour of it all increasingly comes to look like a cover for something far more troubling. When it was first released, The New Yorker criticised Catch-22 for not even seeming to have been written, instead giving the impression of having been shouted onto paper. Although meant as a severe criticism, this actually seems a fair summation of the linguistic style of the novel. I've mentioned above Catch-22's many derivations into disconnected anecdotes, and the narration often seems to be locked in a kind of stream of consciousness, unable to resist expanding on tiny details of a certain character's backstory. This can be somewhat discombobulating on reading the novel, yet it works well in imitating the rambling mess hall storytelling that one imagines serves for entertainment on a military base. More than this, however, it also echoes the frustrating fixation on often pointless detail which pervades the military bureaucracy in which Yossarian and his comrades find themselves trapped. I suggested earlier that the world of Catch-22 often feels absurd, and in terms of genre we could do worse than to describe the novel as a work of absurdism. Numerous commentators have pointed to the presence of a Kafkaesque element to Catch-22. Brian Way, for instance, notes similarities to Kafka's The Trial, in which the protagonist, Joseph K., finds himself accused of an unspecified crime by a faceless and seemingly unaccountable authority. Certainly, Yossarian's attempts to find meaning for his presence in the Mediterranean and his attempts to navigate the pedantic rules of the military often mirror Joseph K.'s attempts to find a reason for his arrest and secure his own release. The absurdist influence present in Catch-22 can often make the novel a frustrating read, particularly as it manifests itself in the novel's linguistic form. Conversations between the novel's characters often seem to go round and round in circles indefinitely. Yet I would argue that this frustration is a key element of the novel's success, as it allows the frustration that Yossarian feels in the world around him to bleed into the very language of the book. So, to conclude, Catch-22 may be a novel about the Second World War, but it is actually more accurately read as a response to the Korean and Vietnam conflicts which followed it. In many ways, it thus likely speaks well to present military interventions, which often lack moral certainty or even clear goals. Beyond its astute commentary on war, however, the novel captures more broadly the frustration that one often feels when faced with overreaching and illogical authority. Despite, and often because of the infusion of this frustration into its very language, it is a warm and often laugh-out-loud funny and remains a must-read novel. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you found it interesting, particularly if you're planning on reading Catch-22, and if you weren't already, then maybe it's inspired you to do so. Thanks, as always, to Ash for signing up to the top tier on my Patreon page. If you'd like to support what I do here, creating educational videos here on YouTube, then please do consider popping over to my Patreon page, link down below, and checking that out. Finally, liking this video is always really helpful, or also sharing it with a friend. But with that all out of the way, thank you very much for watching once again, and have a great week.